Game 11. To put an introduction to this video, I would say time management. Let's dive in, and you would see what I mean by time management. We had one knight f3, but by Gukesh, d5, c4. So this move order is interesting because black could play d4. If you know the positions are, after d4, it's pretty much okay to play. If you don't know it, it may give some uncomfortable position with black. So we had actually Ding play d4, and then we had b4. And then we had c5, e3, knight f6. Now Ding spent like a lot of time on this move. I think he played this before, if I'm not mistaken. He played this before, maybe 2021, where he actually won the game. He won the game, but maybe he doesn't recall the game. He doesn't want to walk into like prepared lines. So he played this, he eventually played knight f6, e3. So it's small ideas by Gukesh. But black has to be, he has to play precise, because that center could be a big issue for him, from black's perspective. So we have bishop g4, we have pawn takes, and then we had h3. At this point, Ding spent like almost an hour thinking. So, after takes here, I think queen takes, and then we had queen c7. Now, Gukesh had some time here. He played the fast move. I think the best move here by far is like c5. This position is, you have the two bishops, right? The bishops enjoy open diagonals. I think the much more effective diagonals over here, as opposed to like g2. So c5 was a recommended move by the computer. It's also allowing, he's just making use, I think c5, bishop b5 is really the ideas. Some kind of like bishop b2. And this is comfortable position from white's perspective. The next move is a little bit shocking because you could understand, it maybe feel like it's an easy move to make and it was made quickly. So this move is, the problem is this bishop is like being shut down on f1, right? There's no diagonals here. You could argue and say the other one is pretty, white would love to do something like this. Bishop g2 is not as easy. The problem with d3, I saw this idea fast enough. Once you play d3, what come across here, the next move is pretty logical, pretty strong actually. a5. So black is trying to say, well, I just want to takes. Rook would be hanging on e1. So, should you play b5, which happens in the next move? Knight comes here. It's obviously a really good square for the knight on c5, and which you could see now the bishop is being blocked by its own pawns. We always tell people that when they have two bishops, you need like open diagonals. So you would rather have like, this is the reason why the computer felt like c5 early on. It's just to keep the diagonal open for the bishop. So you could see that this bishop e2, and it's not enough diagonals for the bishops. So you just maybe need to go to the other side of the board. But we had g3. Now I have honestly, this move came in after 1 hour of syncing by Gukesh. I don't understand why. I mean, you could make this move and you could start syncing maybe. The bishop has to start moving somewhere, so g2 makes sense. But now you could see that the clock are, balanced between both players. They spend a lot of time in like 2-3 moves, and all level by just one move by Gukesh. Actually, I feel like maybe black is doing great here, and this is the reason why he's sinking. So the knight sitting on c5 is pretty annoying. d3 pawn would be a problematic pawn to keep protecting it. So after a long sink, we have this move. I mean, I was expecting like some kind of like a unique move after 1 hour of sinking, but we still had g3, which we were expecting during the game. So we have bishop g2. Knight here. I actually feel like black is actually better at this point. Now, I just want to take time and explain, because people always have this idea that two bishops always better. The right when people ask me, they always tell me, do you rather have the two bishops, two knights? Bishop and knight versus two bishops. I always tell them depends on the position. This is actually the right answer. Two bishops, assuming are they control two diagonals, right? You would love to have the two diagonals being controlled, right? If you have the two diagonals open up, for you in an open board, yes, the two bishops are pretty strong. But there are situations like this game. You have the two bishops. You could argue and say, "Well, I have this diagonal. I have this diagonal," and actually, white might be worse in this game. There's always dynamic. Just because you have the two bishop doesn't automatically give you a better position, right? It depends on how the position is. Depending on the game, depending on how close the game is it very open, very close? I mean, if it's close position, it does favor the knight. How is the opponent pieces? Just like you could see right now, those two knights are, the other knight is jumping on e5. So it's, when you're dealing with two bishops or you have a trade, you have to think about, the long term. Sometimes you could say, well, two bishops are pretty good, but the position is calling for knights. So maybe you just trade the bishops for knights because, the position may be very closed. So you make this kind of decision as you go, depending on the position. That's because two bishops are always. I mean, people assuming two bishops are good. I would love to have them every single game. That's not the case, and we have a good example in this position where you have the two bishops. But black is actually active. Was his setup. So we have castles here, and then we had knight here. It's starting to look like really tough position, depending on how you defend it. So we had this way. I think if should you take here, you take here. Even here it looks like white may have. I mean, black may be still active. However, we had rook here. I actually felt during the game that why not just castle long? But it feels like it doesn't seem to work. The computer doesn't seem to like it a lot. But I was, saying maybe castling long. The reason I have for castling long is to protect the queen on c7. You could see that with queen f4, there are kind of like the knight cannot really take on d3 because the queen would be on c7 hanging. So rook d8 is probably the better approach. And then you're looking at knight takes here. We had, this is not a great move. I think, the computer was suggesting maybe a knight here, take on here, something like here, and then you cannot take here because of as we mentioned, the queen will be hanging. You take here and then queen e4. This position is kind of strange because, you're sacking a pawn, but you getting your pieces activated now. You develop your pieces, and now you're trying to prove that the two bishops are doing, some kind of play. You're really going after this b7 pawn. This pawn's maybe really good at some point. So this is actually the best Gukesh could do in this position. It's pretty much balanced here. Interesting enough. But we had this move. And this is what we consider like a passive move. I think here maybe black is maybe much better with the next couple moves. White have a problem developing. You also have to be concerned about knight b3 at some point. So we had... This move is pretty much strange. I think, black has a lot easier way to play the game is just e6. I don't know why Ding didn't play e6. It just came in as a little bit surprising to me. E6 is very logical move. You just simply want to do like bishop d6. You're looking at knight takes d3 at some point. You want a castle. You're just putting this bishop in this diagonal much more effectively, right? You want to protect on c5 also the knight. You do have to be precise with the developing of the pieces. g6, it just felt like it's too slow. Should you have the bishop on g7, perhaps? If you make some waiting moves like this, white could easily come back to the game, right? So I felt like e6 is just more than enough. This is pretty much strong. Maybe if Ding were to play this, maybe things could change, perhaps. would have changed a lot of things because e6 does change the position right now in favor for black, and it's tough to see a move, by Gukesh because now the pawn is being, under a series I mean, it's hard to defend that pawn. The knights are so effective on the queen. Also in f4 is maybe almost misplaced. So there's ways you could play this position. E6 was just came in as like a better move for me, but G6 feel like it's too slow. Black trying to develop pieces, but you just needed to develop pieces better on E6. So after here we have A4, and this maybe is the only move in this position. So Gukesh is probably saying bishop E3, and and then maybe we could distract the queen somehow to trade one of those knights, and then you could make use of this bishop being on G2. Actually, I'm starting to feel like this bishop on G2 is having some good diagonals right now. So this is the reason why E6 should have been played. So we had H5. I don't understand H5, to be honest. I think this is also like maybe trying to keep the game going because you're looking at bishop H6. But I think after bishop E3, maybe, I think white is equalized. Or actually B6. We had B6 first. B6 is one of the moves, and this is one of the reasons why maybe having the pawn here, and then you could, when B6 happens, you take the bishop defending C5 at some point. You cannot take right now because the queen, but there are some lines later where you just need to defend the knight. Assuming, you have E4, bishop E3, the knight would be protected by the bishop on F8 after E6. But here, we had B6, and you could see that B6 is also problematic long term for for black. Maybe this B5 could be controlled by white. So when you played B6 after E6, like let's say around here, just going back to explain what I mean. It was here, so you don't have time. You don't really have time for B6. Let's say you play something like this. You don't have time for this. Could you just simply take or something? Would be like no problem. And you could see the bishop is having more control now. This like knight takes here. It becomes like black pieces are very strong. The pieces are sitting on good squares. So you don't have B6 idea there. So I felt like this was a key moment in the game where G6 does feel like too slow, A4, H5, and then we had B6, and then we had Queen D6. He could have played Queen B8, but I think Dink wanted his queen on D6. And then we had Bishop E3, and again, this is a very strong move. This is like pinning the knight. So should you play Bishop H6? And that's actually the reason why I don't like Bishop H6. Let's say it happens right now, which I think it did. Bishop takes here and some kind of Queen E4, and now you're looking at a completely different game. You're giving up the bishop pair, but this is starting to look really like white is active now. He's developing these pieces. The B5 square is now like, a square that white could take with a knight or even with a rook. So this all happened, and Queen E4, you could see that's enough. Now white would like to take this pawn. I think knight C6 maybe the only move, and then we had knight A3. You could see this potential jump here, even knight C2 at some point. So we had rook D7. I think maybe a better move is maybe a castle. You don't have to defend on B7 right now. It's, the knight is sitting on C6. Maybe castling, and maybe you make use of this rook on D6 maybe at some lines. Like rook D6, rook E6 maybe. It's one way to defend this position. Rook D7 happened, and we had knight C2. So taking here, okay, white is giving up the pawn, but look at the activity going on for white. Pieces are like actively. If you look at this bishop at H6 is not doing anything, even though it's controlling the diagonal. So this is what makes chess complicated. We always tell people controlling the diagonal makes sense. The bishop on G2 is by far better than bishop on H6. And you could argue like, oh, they both controlling diagonals. There are a difference. When you control diagonals, you have to make use of the diagonals. If it's like this diagonal sitting here, you're not gonna play like there's no pieces gonna land here. You're not gonna play rook c1. There's not much going on in this diagonal. It looks like the bishop is out of, the bishop maybe belonged to d6. If you look at the bishop, let's say visualizing the bishop on d6, it would have this control much better. It could also defend. But when you have the bishop here, it controls one diagonal, but this diagonal, nothing is happening on it. So it doesn't make sense. Bishop on g2 does have some ideas. You might have rook takes b7 in some lines, and the queen, the bishop are really acting together actively, where black is a little passive in this position. So this is the reason why I felt like g6, h5, this idea is not very good. So we had a rook here, and then queen c7, and then rook b5. You could see now this, the other rook might come to b1, and then b7 is going to be difficult to defend in some lines. We have castles, and then we had knight e1. I felt like this move is kind of like strange. I understand the idea, knight b3. Maybe it's a little bit too slow. Maybe Dink had like rook d6, rook e6 ideas. There might be potential of knight b4 in some lines. Maybe here the rook comes in, the queen, where the queen is going. You could argue and say maybe black could hang on because even though the bishop is sitting on h6, his opposite color bishop should maybe more pieces traded. This becomes maybe like a draw, even though black is passive a little bit here. But we had this move. I don't know why this move is being played. Honestly, the pawn is not being really under attack. I felt like maybe the rook d6 is probably a better move. Like putting the rook better on d6 than d7, and some rook e6 ideas would have been interesting for black. But we had here. By the way, the time pressure here, you're looking at 8 minutes. Again, time management is key. I think 8 minutes in this position, and you still have like, 50 moves to go. It may be difficult to hold from black's perspective. This, black pieces feels like a little bit passive, maybe easy to make some moves, but white could come up with better ideas slowly because it's still like, white still has some time, even though it's 14 minutes, but I felt like, this position needed more time, and if Dink didn't spend a lot of time on, let's say, knight f6 and some other moves, maybe I think things could change. We had knight b3, and then e6, I don't understand. Maybe rook d6 again? Again, rook d6 is possibly another way again. Maybe this is the only way you could play. But we had e6. I don't understand what this move does. You could see that every single piece is now attacking. We have now, I think, knight c5. I think maybe rook e7 was his idea. Rook e7, and then we had here. I think the only move here that black could have done is knight b4, possibly knight b4. Try to hang on a little bit, and then maybe the bishop could go to f8 at some point, which again the bishop you could see not doing anything in this diagonal. You could see that most of the pieces are light squares anyway. The queen, the rook here, and black bishop on h6 not doing anything. So we had, unfortunately, here we had this move, and again, I think the reason this move was being played because of the time. Normally, a top GM would not make this move. You could pause the video, and if you found a winning move, good job. If you don't find it, work on your tactics. Do a lot of puzzles. Here, queen c8 is just simply a mistake, and it's not. There's no way you could defend the position. So if you pause the video and you found the tactic, good for you. If you haven't, as I mentioned, you just need to do more puzzles. So unfortunately, here is this queen takes c6, winning a piece, and the problem is, do you take here, something like here, and then you would have an extra knight. The problem is because the king is sitting on g8. And should you, doesn't matter which way. This is also here, here, here. It's doesn't matter. You still win a piece. And unfortunately, here we, it's a blunder. But I think the problem comes down to like time management, and it was kind of difficult to hold this. I think maybe a night before would much easier move to make, and maybe it could have been a drawn, but it again 7 minutes is kind of difficult to make, especially with no increment. So we had a win by Gukesh in game 11, and stay tuned for game 12 and beyond. See you folks soon.